welcome to all our attendees. This is a bit of an unorthodox session of the Asia-Pacific Study Group of the Canadian International Council National Capital Branch. Thank you for joining us in the midst of this new normal. I would like to welcome our esteemed speaker, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who you've received his bio, but he's with the Japan Institute of International Affairs, as well as the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and various other organizations that he's a bit of a star and a friend of the study group. We had him speak to a similar situation regarding Japan about 2 years ago. But the situation has changed quite a bit, so I think it certainly bears renewing and reviewing. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jonathan, who will be speaking on Abe's, the Prime Minister of Japan's, and his cabinet and Japanese politics in general, and the challenges faced by Japan during this time where there are increased China-US tensions, and not only that, but of course in the midst of a pandemic. So full of challenges and full of interesting questions and hopefully interesting answers. So please take it away, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you to Josh and Jeff from the Asia-Pacific Study Group, and also to the CIC. It's I think it's not, a lot of us are getting used to these virtual or becoming Zoomers, the virtual meetings, but I've had the chance to join a couple of the Asia-Pacific Group sessions and talk on Japan and its geopolitical situation. And I'm happy to kind of be able to do this again at quite an extraordinary period, actually. So I think through today's discussion, and I'm very much hoping that this is a discussion and a conversation, I'd like to make some remarks for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we can kind of open it up to some discussion, I hope, and hear some of your insights. But it is a remarkable time for a lot of countries, Canada included, but Japan has been, influenced by a number of different factors. What I'd like to kind of talk about today, first of all, I'd like to kind of set the stage a bit with COVID-19 in particular and how that has impacted Prime Minister Abe, how that has impacted his cabinet, his political standing, but also the regional situation. So many of the issues that we'll discuss today were pre-existing COVID, and they will continue after Abe as well. But how has the pandemic influenced some of the tensions and hotspots around Japan, or some of the areas that I'd like to discuss today? So first of all, I think it's, a lot of leaders have kind of had impacts to their own approval and their own popularity as a result of the pandemic. I think Abe's is no exception to this. I think Prime Minister Abe, when he took office in late 2012, he's, in many ways, I think he's been kind of described as Teflon politically. I mean, especially considering the history of Japanese prime ministers since the end of the war. Abe now has the distinguished title of being the longest modern day Japanese prime minister. So he's had quite a lot of political endurance, and he's been able to endure his tenure through a number of political scandals, through the Trump administration, the ups and downs of that, through tensions with China, North Korea, South Korea. So he's been through a lot. But I think that things are reaching a very difficult level right now for Abe. I don't know if it's the right thing to frame it as Abe fatigue, but his approval has been shocked quite a bit by some of the aftermath of COVID. The initial elements of that were included in some of the economic stimulus packages related to the pandemic, and the efficiency in which those were dispersed, some of the kind of the handouts that were legislated. So there was a bit of a criticism on that. There's also been additional scandals and gaffes within the party, and in particular those close to Abe, which have impacted his political stability. So I won't get into too much speculation about how long Abe will last. But I think the more important question that I think that we need to think about, and perhaps we can kind of do that towards the end of my talk, and your questions can look at it, is what comes after Abe, and what does that mean for foreign policy and security policy in the region? Because I think that's really what I'm most fixated on. So we have COVID-19, and we have some of the issues, how that's domestically affected Japan. But elsewhere in the region, I think we've seen, as Josh kind of mentioned in the onset on his remarks, quite a significant and in many ways acute uptick of tensions between the US and China. Again, many of these tensions were pre-existing COVID. I think the Trump administration, and really from a bipartisan perspective in Washington, there's been a turning of the page on China. But we've seen, with regard to some of the he said, she said on the sort of origins of COVID, a very nasty sort of information war that's been kind of happening back and forth. And then we're also seeing kind of a heightening of some of the pre-existing trends, whether it's kind of disputes on technology, semiconductors, and other issues that I think are really creating strong fault lines in the relationship between US and China, but are also instructive to the US's most important allies, Japan being one of them. Of course, Canada is also not immunized from this. So that's some backdrop that I think is really important to think about more broadly on how COVID has kind of changed the stage, or has kind of altered the stakes a little bit for Japan and for Abe in the region. We also have the situation in Hong Kong, which has added additional pressure to Abe's China policy. And I think this kind of segues me into the second part of what I want to discuss today. And this is sort of the heart of the areas that I want to detail a bit on, is the regional situation. And again, I'm going to go through, very lightly on some of these areas, because I mean, each one could be a webinar in itself. But if there's one that kind of intrigues you a bit more, then we can explore that. The one area I want to focus the most time on, because I think it's the most critical part of what's happening in Japan's region, is the relationship with China. COVID, I think, had quite a significant factor in that relationship. So while structurally and really systematically, I think that relationship hasn't fundamentally changed as a result of the pandemic. Some of the tensions on both sides remain. Some of the rationale for engagement economically remain, despite some shifts here and there. But I think that there has been a significant change in the water as a result of the pandemic. One of the most important things to point to is that April was supposed to be, not only is it the cherry blossoms and all the other lovely things in Japan in April, but was also supposed to be a very important sort of political and diplomatic event with Xi Jinping visiting Japan. That was slated to be a state level visit, which is significant in itself. As a result of the pandemic, that clearly did not happen. And I think it's important to think about that visit symbolically. Xi has not visited Japan in his role and now as Chinese president. And in many ways, if you think back to the most tense period, I would say, in the past 15 years of Sino-Japanese relations, 2010, 11, 12, 13, Xi basically at that point kind of, stood his ground and basically said, okay, I'm not making any concessions to meet unless Japan makes concessions on the Senkaku or makes some sort of other sort of concessions, pretty much saying he was going to freeze out Abe. The interesting thing as you kind of forward ahead 7 years, is that really Japan made very little concessions, and she had planned to come to Japan. So in many ways, Japan has slowly become the demander in that relationship with China. So I think that while navigating having Xi Jinping in Japan would have its own challenges, and I think Abe received criticism from some of the more conservative side within the Liberal Democratic Party, it also provided some political and diplomatic opportunity for him as well. So that's a sort of an opportunity lost. To go into more of the details of that relationship, though, and how things have changed or how they are changing, you would see, I think probably in the past year, especially before the pandemic, a lot of articles, a lot of press clippings that would kind of be talking about, the thaw or the détente in Japan-China relations, and how things were starting to get a little bit better. Maybe Trump was scaring both sides and pushing them together. I tried to push back on that, and still sort of push back on that notion quite a bit. And I think that you're seeing the proof in the pudding in many ways. And it's not just because the summit was canceled because of COVID, but if you look at some of the areas of most acute tension between the two sides, one of them being the territorial dispute in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands, actually the trend lines are worsening. Senkaku, I think to many people, is sort of the forgotten man of all the hotspots in Asia. You have South China Sea, you have the Korean Peninsula, which always gets attention here and there. Now you have China-India tensions on the border, the line of actual control. You have Taiwan Strait. So there's a lot of different tensions happening in East Asia. And I think the Senkaku kind of gets forgotten. But since I think it's early or mid-April, the Chinese different forms of maritime vessels have been made a presence in the contiguous zone. So the 12-mile kind of zone outside Japan's territorial seas every day up until now. So this is China really reasserting that it wants to coercively change the status quo. So the idea that China is trying to play nice with Japan to kind of, restore some high-level diplomacy, I think that assumption needs to be questioned when you see what's kind of happening around the Senkaku. Also, it's not just the issue of what's happening in the territorial realm. We still have, I think, at least 10 or 12 Japanese citizens who are detained in China on national security related charges. So obviously in Canada, we're very concerned about the two Michaels, as we often refer to them, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. But Japan has been dealing with this routinely, and other countries have been doing this, frankly, as well. And has a lot of sort of expertise and experience in dealing with their own detainees in China. So that's something that's important to mention. And finally, and I think I'll kind of touch on this just very briefly in my last section on sort of national security changes happening in Japan, but I think that the old bifurcation of Japan-China relations, sort of economically hot, politically cold, and the idea that maybe we can sort of bifurcate the politics from the economy, I think that really never was perfectly made sense. And I think that we're seeing that sort of bifurcation really is dissolving now. One of the most important changes I think Japan has been making to its national security architecture is the placement of economic security issues at the forefront of its national security. Now it's reformed its National Security Council and the supporting National Security Secretariat, so the bureaucrats who work in the National Security Council, to focus on economic security. They have their own economic security division now that's looking at a host of economic security challenges, and China, I think, is foremost in mind. So, again, not to kind of pour pessimism on everything, I think Japan, on the silver lining side, has a much more nuanced relationship vis-a-vis China than, for example, the U.S. I think some elements of the Trump approach to the U.S. Japan welcomes, but perhaps the tactics and the rhetoric is something that is not something that Japan would do, especially on trade. But I think that we should question the idea that Japan and China are on a positive trajectory, and that they're kind of working through their troubles. Because from my perch, I don't see that. So I'll leave it there on Japan-China. On Russia issues, again, that's something that I won't dive into now just because of time. But if someone has a particular interest in what's happening with Russia and their territorial dispute, we can talk about that. I did want to touch very quickly on the Korean Peninsula. Again, a tense area. I mean, I think I remember a good friend of mine when I was in Japan had once mentioned that Japan is friendly with almost every country in the world. It's just not friendly with 4 of its neighbors. So it's outside of unfortunately the Korean Peninsula, China and Russia. Japan has friends everywhere. But these are the areas that have significant tensions for Japan. The Korean Peninsula has continued. COVID again has really stopped nothing. Kim Jong-un continues to kind of perfect his short-range missile testing. A couple of them have splashed into the Sea of Japan since the pandemic has happened. I think North Korea is getting increasingly impatient, understanding that there's a US election in November as well. So there's a lot of posturing happening in North Korea. From Japan's perspective, Abe remains the kind of, in some ways, the odd man out, the only one of the former six-party talks not to have met with Kim. But there's no real imperative to. Not only has, on the abduction issue, which is very important to the Japanese, there's been no movement. But on the political security side as well, Japan sees no sort of avenue to justify that politically. The last thing I would kind of mention on the Korean Peninsula, and this sort of relates to the U.S. alliance as well, which I think is a really important issue that to see how it plays out in the coming months, is the most recent decision from Japan's Ministry of Defense to suspend or put on hold the deployment of the Aegis ashore missile defense, ballistic missile defense system. I think that's a very interesting decision. There's a lot of different layers to it. I think they're looking at different alternatives. But if I think back to the days, especially the Fire and Fury days of a couple of years back, and how much Japan's maritime self-defense forces, which are constantly patrolling the Sea of Japan with their Aegis-equipped ships, how much fatigue they have, it does present some unique defense challenges for Japan, in addition to alliance challenges on how to manage it with the U.S., particularly if Trump is reelected in November. So that's something potentially we can explore a little bit more in question period. The last kind of thing I want to talk about, and again, because I'm really excited to kind of get to hear from everyone, is more broadly what's coming up in national security terms for Japan. How are they looking to kind of react to all this? And then finally, I'm going to end on looking at politically, what's going to happen after Abe. What is the plan? Is there a plan? Who's on the list? And then I'll kind of open it up. So on the national security side, I think this year is going to be very critical for Japan, the end of this year. I mean, a lot of people have written off 2020 already due to COVID, but there are some significant developments that I think Japan is still looking to take at the end of this year. One crucial one, I think, is that they're in the midst of developing a new national security strategy. So you may remember in 2013, just after Abe was elected, a lot of these documents came out, the new national security strategy, first ever actually national security strategy, the initiation of the National Security Council, again, Japan's first ever National Security Council, reviewed national defense guidelines, and so a host of kind of retrofitting Japan's defense and national security establishment. I do think that this, not everything's going to be undone, and it's not going to be start from scratch. But I think that there's a recognition that a lot has changed from 2013. While some of the trend lines, vis-a-vis North Korea and vis-a-vis China, are still there, perhaps worsening, perhaps ebbs and flows. I think that there's other issues that really need to be dealt with, and I think one of the key ones that they'll need to focus on is technology. So. As I mentioned before, economic security is something that the Japanese are very much focused on. They also have put a deep think into 5G and other elements of their economic supply chains with China. I think COVID has sort of hastened that the urgency to have those discussions as well and to look at supply chains, especially on technology. And finally, I think their relationship with the U.S. and frankly, the U.S.-China relationship on technology, it really is requiring a deep rethink in Japan on some of their reliance from Chinese markets in the technology space. I think you're seeing this in other U.S. allies too. I think Canada will have to be thinking about this, but the United Kingdom this is a big part of its rethink on its 5G decisions and on its technology cooperation with China. So big things are happening. Obviously, Aegis, as I mentioned before, that decision is going to be interesting to see how they manage that with the U.S. alliance. The other, thing, to throw on the plate too is that Japan is in the midst of negotiating with the U.S. on special measures agreement, which is basically host nation support, burden sharing. And I'm sure everyone loved diving into John Bolton's book, like a tabloid. But there's one of the nuggets that sort of, whether it's confirmed or, that was widely speculated, but is the very exorbitant ask that the United States made on Japan, I think 8 billion or something, for a fourfold increase for host nation support, and sort of bartering the U.S. forces in Japan if they don't pay. So this sort of, we're used to this sort of negotiation tactics from the Trump administration, but I think this brings to clear just what a challenge Japan's going to have in the coming months. I think there was some optimistic thoughts of U.S.-Japan alliance watchers that maybe it would be different from South Korea, for example. So South Korea and NATO, obviously we know the context there as well, that Trump has been hard on NATO, had a very tough time with the Trump administration and is still having a tough time on host nation support and alliance burden sharing. I think there were some optimists who thought maybe Japan's a bit different. Maybe we are the ally, the cornerstone in Asia. But it seems that America first spares no one, and this is something I think we really need to be focused on, seeing how this is dealt with. So I'll leave it there on national security. Again, last comment, and then I'll happy to open it up. So Abe is slated, on Abe himself, he's slated to his final term. It will be slated to end in 2021. Obviously, the Olympics being canceled or postponed was a deep disappointment to him politically. I think the fact that a lot of his other sort of legacy moments, if you were to frame it that way, some of the things he's invested a lot in, the abductions issue, I think rhetorically he's put a lot of time into. Russia, I think not just rhetorically, he's met with Putin almost 40 times or maybe over 40 times, been to Russia at least 11 or 12 times since 2013. So he's invested a lot of energy and frankly, in a very difficult geopolitical space with Russia not being on the friend list of really anyone in the West. And I think, Abe has really got to sort of get out of jail free card in a way from the fact that the Trump administration isn't too fixated on Russia, at least in that sense. So he's been able to kind of maneuver that relationship with Russia without getting as much blowback from America as he probably would have had, and he did indeed have from the Obama administration. So there's been no real shining legacy moment that I think that Abe can look for. The Constitution, obviously, changing the Constitution, which is something that I think Abe's desired for a while too, looks like it remains out of reach politically. It just the time to kind of get that across right now doesn't seem realistic. So that sort of left him with the Olympics, and unfortunately, the Olympics, due to COVID, no doing of his own, are now postponed. So if he's able to see through the end of his term, he would end on the Olympics, which I think would be a nice kind of a way to end for him. But as I mentioned at the onset of my talk, there's strong headwinds right now, and fatigue on Abe. One of his very close political confidants, former Minister of Justice, Kawai Katsuyuki, was recently arrested along with his wife. And this is just the latest in a string of sort of political scandals and gaffes that might be hard for him to overcome. But what I would say is that Japan's opposition remains sort of anemic and unable to really muster much challenge. So, Abe's been counted out before, and his last days have been numbered before, and we'll wait to see the ink dry on that before putting a firm date on his last days in office. So we can talk a bit more if you're interested on potential successors, how things might look after Abe. But I think at this point I'll open it up and thank you again to CIC for having me.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that overview. I think you covered quite a bit of ground there. So I will now give it over to questions. I'd just like to remind people, everybody that's watching, so you can direct your questions to the Q&A tab. So you click down on more down below, and then you click on Q&A, and then it opens up a tab where you can write in your questions. We do have some already, so I will go to them. Margaret McQuaig Johnston would like to congratulate you on a great presentation. But further to that, she would like to ask, after the 2012 problems with China, Japan decided to broaden and deepen its relations with other countries in the region. This is something that Canada too may want to consider in the wake of our serious problems with China. Can you talk about how that went as Japan built stronger relations with others in the region? I think this is a very interesting question. It allows us to compare experiences and perhaps learn things that we can do here in Canada. So please, Jonathan.
Well, yeah, thank you, Margaret. And it's nice. I can't see you, but it's good to. I look forward to the chance to see you again soon. It's a good question. Yeah, the one kind of word or acronym or phrase I didn't mention during my talk, and maybe I was remiss not to do that, but was the FOIP, or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific concept. And I think sort of what you're getting at is that this is sort of Japan's, whether it's called a strategy. I think originally it was called a strategy, and now it's not, but vision is what it's referred to now. But Japan's sort of outlook for the region, FOIP. I think that there are a lot of things that the Canadian side can learn from this. So, first of all, Japan's vision or strategy has changed, since it originally was kind of, the idea came out. I mean, a lot of people think back to Abe's article in Project Syndicate about the security diamond, the democratic security diamond, and very much focused at like a securitization of Japan's regional strategy. And that sort of idea, whether it was accurate or not to what Abe believed, but that was the kind of the generic perception in Washington and other places, that Japan was looking at kind of great powers in the region banding together to sort of counteract some of the Chinese activities in the region. And that great powers, that was the US, India, Australia, and Japan, often referred to as the Quad. I think that a number of factors have changed Japan's regional approach. I mean, the Quad still exists, and maybe it was rebirthed after 2007, and now it's kind of it's working again, but it's still very it's tentative. I think they call it consultations. They're trying to kind of keep the profile low, but I think the idea that everything is centered on the Quad for Japan has really fundamentally changed. One of the biggest reasons for this is Japan, most of its diplomatic capital in the region has been poured into ASEAN in Southeast Asia over the years, over decades, through overseas development assistance, through strong diplomatic presence. They've put the time in Southeast Asia, and now they're a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think they didn't want to squander that. And frankly, I think they just started listening a bit more to Southeast Asian countries' concerns about FOIP, FOIP 1.0. There's a good professor in Japan who talks about FOIP 1.0, FOIP 2.0, and the evolution of FOIP. And I think his point, which I would tend to agree with in some ways, is that because of some of the concerns in Southeast Asia, that of course the countries are worried about China, but they want to be involved in the process, and they don't want the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific to be taken away from ASEAN and basically focused on the great powers, which is sort of despite the fact that ASEAN has its challenges, it's a natural self-preservation policy. So Japan started listening to that a bit more. How that, just to quickly to quickly finish up and to bring it back to Canada, how that relates to Canada too, is that I think that we are now thinking about developing our own Indo-Pacific approach, Indo-Pacific policy. We have the unit set up to do that within GAC. The one thing I would recommend is that it's tempting to think about this as a reaction to China. And I really much think that we can't look at it like that. Even in the days when I used to be in the bureaucracy in Canada, And we've thought about, Asia strategies, and we didn't frame it as Indo-Pacific at that time. But the rationale has been there and was there to work with Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, India, before even, for example, the Michaels or 5G or some of the tensions that we've had recently with China. We don't need to look at this purely as a way to punish China. This is something that makes sense for Canada as a rules-based country. And one that wants to work with our closest like-minded partners in the region. So I think that's the starting point. The second point is, this need not be, a mimicking of the U.S. strategy. I think this is a line that also sort of frustrates me a little bit too, is that often FOIP has kind of said, well, aren't you just copying Trump? This is a U.S. policy that is very hard-edged and, laced with hard politics in the U.S. And what I remind people is that FOIP and the idea of the Indo-Pacific intellectually basically came from Japan, India, and Australia in many ways. I mean, they might dispute who originated it, but these ideas predated the U.S. I mean, the U.S. kind of came in and basically adopted the Indo-Pacific largely at the urging of Prime Minister Abe. So, we got to get away from this temptation to think that if we adopt an Indo-Pacific approach, that we're kind of succumbing to Trump's pressure on China, because I think they can be different.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we have a question from Darren Bazin, who asks, Aegis Ashore is a spur in Russia's saddle, as well as the U.S. has allowed deployment in Poland. Is this defensive system helping to push China and Russia together to the disadvantage of Japan?
Yeah, so Aegis, it's an interesting, clever question too, because, Russia, there's a couple angles, numerous angles to Aegis, and I think the decision that will still kind of unfold on Aegis Ashore. But obviously the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, I'm not sure South Korea's view, it would seem to kind of reinforce their security interests, but I've kind of given up sometimes on trying to read how the South Koreans react to security issues around Japan. So, but there are concerns in the region, especially with those three, North Korea, Russia, and China. I think in particular with Russia, and just the recent kind of press the state-run press I've been reading in Russia on Aegis very much was a big element in their kind of disputes and their kind of negotiations with Japan. They would point to this, and sometimes even in the discussions over the 4 disputed islands in the Kurils in the north of Hokkaido, they would point to the Aegis deployment and say, again, you're deploying this sort of defense architecture that's essentially going to be U.S. architecture. It'll be the U.S. there. So whether we believe it or not, or whether this is just Russia's own political concoction to say we're not going to do a deal with you, that takes one less irritant, I guess, if you want to frame it, away from Russia, one less excuse really the Russians can kind of use when they're negotiating with Japan on this. So there's a lot of angles to Aegis. I think it's really fascinating to kind of see how other countries in the region will react to this decision.
Thanks. We have a question from Akash Maharaj. He asks, and this is actually a very interesting question, perhaps not so national security oriented, but give you a rough shot. So he asks, Canada has a long history of employing diaspora communities to build commercial and political links to other countries. Is that the case with the Japanese Canadian community and Japan? And if so, are there key issues for that community in Canada-Japan relations?
Yeah, a really good question. My sense, and I've been able to engage with the Japanese diaspora community, here and there for sure. Like I was able to take part in an outreach sort of tour across Canada. It would have been, the years kind of, I guess it was 2019, yeah, or maybe it was early actually 2020. I can't even remember the timing now, but I was able to go in Vancouver and Toronto and engage with a number of different kind of groups, the society groups and some of the business associations. So it's a small community. I think this is, the diaspora, especially those who are interested in some of the business and political issues. It's nothing, compared to the mobilization of, for example, the Chinese community or probably even the Indian community, Canadian Indian community. But But I do find they're quite engaged. The element that I would say that's intriguing about it is, though, I think on business issues, business promotion, ways to kind of promote Japanese business here, vice versa. I think there is those engaged in that, although I think we could have a more active chamber here in Canada. But on political security issues, I found, I don't want to say the depth was low on it. Maybe it's just the interest just seemed to not be very much focused on that. And I think this is a real area to change the framework of how Canada-Japan relations are seen. So obviously we're good at the things we do, tourism, cultural, growing on certain areas of business. We have the TPP now. But understanding some of the synergies and links on the political side and political security side, I think are really important. And that's an area that maybe it takes more engagement from folks like myself. And I know the embassy and consulates are trying very hard on that work as well. So maybe it's just something we all need to kind of work a bit more with them on.
Thanks. We have a question from Andrea Liberté, who asks, how likely is Japan going to push for the enlargement of the CPTPP and work to include Taiwan?
Yeah, so I haven't followed the most recent policy of Japan on this, but I believe the existing policy, which I don't think has changed, is that they are supportive of inclusion with Taiwan. I think Japan has to feather this sort of walk in this relationship like every other country, but I think they've been doing, especially in the Abe administration, they've been growing increasingly closer with Taiwan, and I think have seen the benefit in particular of having Taiwan involved in TPP 11. So the procedures of when that might happen, because a lot of countries want in on TPP now. They may even have to change the name again. It's a long name already now, but they have the UK wants to be in. South Korea is hemmed and hawed on it as well. So there's a range of different players that might want to be in. So I think they may have to procedurally think about does it make more sense to kind of have a group of countries or members kind of come into it at one time. But from my perspective too, I mean, not the government of Japan's, but my personal perspective, I think it absolutely makes sense to have Taiwan involved in the TPP 11. I see no reason why not. And I think even the Canadian side has shown support from that. Maybe not as vocally and as consistently in a sustained manner as they should, but I think at different times they've let it sneak out that they would support that. So I think we should push forward on that.
Thanks. We have a question from Grant Duckworth, who asked a very specific question. Canada has placed great importance on the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Do you envision green infrastructure diplomacy, or green or non-green? The green is in parentheses, as a way to strengthen diplomatic ties with Japan in a post-Abe scenario?
Yeah, great question. I really do. I mean, I think this is something like, what Canada and Japan need to do. I think the TPP from a trade side kind of provides a nice kind of rubric and mechanism. What people sometimes tend to forget, I mean, this crowd absolutely knows, but I think, I was chatting with another group the other day on the TPP, and sometimes what they forget about that is they think of a multilateral agreement, but they forget that it's essentially a Canada-Japan FTA included in that. So it's really important for that exchange between Canada and Japan. But an FTA and the TPP being that is only as good as it's used. And it's only as good as we find specific sectors and specific areas for investment to foreign investment that we can find synergies for, or joint ventures. This to me seems like, definitely fertile ground for both sides. Again, how the political winds will shift on both sides. I think potentially this issue might be a little bit more political here in Canada, depending on which party's in power. But I see this as, regardless of politics, this is going to be an area going forward in the coming 10, 20 years that should make sense for both sides to work together on.
Thanks. We have another question from Darren Bazin, who asks, do you see any possibility that the antipathy between the Koreas and Japan could soften given the strain of COVID-19, or will it be further entrenched?
Okay, so for both North Korea and South Korea?
Yeah, that seemed to be what it was firing at. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I don't, I had a sliver of hope, a 1% improvement, but it seems that it's been misplaced. I don't think structurally much has changed or will change, unfortunately, on this. The one kind of sliver of hope and where this kind of came from was the fact that the Japan, Korea, South Korea, from a bilateral perspective, is in a very, very difficult state. The only sort of mechanism where really the sides can meet is through the trilateral process. So Abe met with Moon last Christmas in China, in Chengdu, during the Trilateral Leaders Summit, Japan, South Korea, and China. And within that process, they also have quite a well set up bureaucracy sort of secretariat there, the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat, that works on particular issues and has ministers and senior officials kind of meeting more frequently. So it's kind of almost like a mini APEC for the three of them. It hasn't always been functioning because in many ways, I call it a triangle from hell. I mean, usually you have either South Korea and China are fighting over THAAD, or China and Japan are fighting over the Senkaku, or Japan and Korea many times are squabbling as well. So it's sometimes hard to even get the meetings together because one side is or two sides of that triangle are often at odds. But it does provide opportunities on issues like this. One of the areas where the trilateral has worked pretty well in the past is like on Ebola and other health security issues. So that was where my sliver of optimism came, that things might get better. But politically, it's a real wasp's nest right now, especially between Japan and Korea. I mean, we all know, we've all been following, obviously, the issues with wartime labor and the Supreme Court decision in Korea. The comfort women issue remains a little bit more idle, but there still is tensions over that. They still have their territorial dispute in the Sea of Japan. And now they're squabbling at UNESCO as well over the designation of Hashima Island and sites from Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, which South Korea says were used for forced labor. So there is all of these things, not only have they not gone away, but specific dates keep coming that make things worse. We have, I think it's in August, or no, maybe it was coming up very soon anyways, that the decision that South Korea the courts need to make on Nippon Steel, which was, found guilty of wartime laborers in South Korea. And the decision has to come on the potential seizure of assets. I think that's a huge decision. If that is made and there's a movement to kind of seize assets from Nippon Steel in South Korea, it might get to an irreparable state.
Thanks. We have another question from Andre Liberté, this time on immigration policy. So he asks, how likely is Japan going to rethink its policy to help it address the aging of its population, in particular opening the possibility of migrant caregivers from Southeast Asia?
Yeah, another good question. I think, so Abe has kind of put some time into this, and I think at some political cost too. So again, forgive me for the exact dates on this, but I think at least within the last 2 years, he passed legislation on temporary foreign workers. And again, this was something that was not easy. So as I referenced earlier on the China discussions, there are more conservative elements within his party that sort of pushed back on parts of this. And the same was done on temporary foreign workers. So this is a kind of a pinprick to deal with the problem. I mean, it needs to be a much more strategic and long-term approach to this issue. But I think Abe does recognize this. I think it is sort of built into his Abenomics sort of plan, in addition to kind of encouraging women in the workplace and other elements. So I think that I think he's aware of it. I feel compared to other Japanese leaders in the past 10, 15 years, he's put more time to it, but have the measures been sufficient? I'm not going to, sit here and tell you that they have. It's a challenging thing politically to kind of get across. So I think this is something, it's going to have to be a continuing discussion in Japan.
Thanks. So we've gone through all the questions. That was quite a range. That was great. Thank you, Jonathan. I'd now like to hand it over to Jeff, just to talk about the business of the study group. I'd also like to note that we are, as a study group, we like to guard our independence jealously sometimes. But in this particular case with the webinar, we are piggybacking on the CIC's infrastructure. So if there was ever a time to sign up for a CIC membership, now might be the time to support events like this and other events like the exclusive events, including the one with Dominic Barton that we had last month. So yeah, Jeff, can you take us into just the quick business that we have?
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. And I'm also like to extend a great thanks to our speaker today. It was a very stimulating discussion, and I know I certainly learned a lot. Japan is an important country in the Asia-Pacific region. One we haven't had a lot of events on here, but I think everybody was engaged, at least what I could tell from the active Q&A. So thanks for that. As Josh indicating future business. Unfortunately, folks, know we had a lot less sessions this year. We had the change in chairmanship where our good friend Vincent retired to focus on a new job, and we were very lucky to have Josh join us. And then shortly, as we were just getting our wheels greased, we ran into COVID, and it took a little while for us to figure out how to get an online session. So to that degree, we'd also like to extend some thanks to CIC, and in particular our friend Samuel, who has helped to organize that. We do believe that this will be the last event for this season. As with last year, we quit around June, but we do definitely plan to be back again in September. And as always, we would like to hear from the group what topics are of most interest to you. So if folks wanted to send an email to us with ideas, there's no guarantee we'll be able to get everybody right away. But we definitely would like to canvass folks to see what they would like to see going forward for next season. So with that, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming out today, for showing up for the couple of events we have this year, and to wish best wishes to everybody for the summer, but also to hope that everyone's had a good time during this, a good safe time during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so thank you to everybody for attending. Fantastic questions. That was quite a battery. And thank you to Jonathan for being with us. That was a great session. If by the time we start up in the next season, we still have to do it like this, I mean, it's a loss to not see your faces and bask in your presence, but this is doable. This is all right. So yeah, thank you to everyone, and yes, particularly Samuel Lamoa, who has just been completely on point with all the CIC-NCB events. We could not have done this without him. So thanks very much.
Thanks again for all the great questions. They were fantastic questions.